8 years ago, a 34-year-old man vanished from his own cabin in Gardner, Montana, in the shadow of Yellowstone's rugged wilderness. It was a late summer evening, the kind when the pine-scented air feels heavy with approaching night, and the faint buzz of distant cicadas filled the stillness. Marcus Hale, a National Park Service ranger, had always been meticulous in his routines, and that evening seemed no different. Lights turned off at precise hours. Equipment stored just so. His quiet presence felt like part of the natural rhythm of the small, timbered home he shared only with his dog. Local authorities initially leaned toward an accidental disappearance, a tragic misstep in the backcountry he knew so intimately. Yet, one close colleague who had shared early morning patrols with Marcus never accepted that simple explanation, feeling the weight of something far darker lurking just beyond what the eye could see. Over the ensuing 8 years, the trail went cold. What began as a presumed accident became a file gathering dust in the records room of the Yellowstone station. The preserved photographs of his cabin, the personal effects left untouched, and the faint traces that hinted at another presence in the night lingered in storage. A silent testament to a life suddenly interrupted. A routine event in the near future, a process that would require Marcus's fingerprints, would collide with the evidence from that fateful night, bringing dormant clues roaring back to life. The details of how this convergence would happen remained unknown, but the undercurrent of anticipation, of a truth waiting to emerge, held the story in suspension. Before that evening, Marcus's life had been grounded in discipline and quiet purpose. Gardner, Montana, hugged the northern edge of Yellowstone, its small town streets flanked by lodges and the occasional log cabin, surrounded by the jagged sweep of mountains. Marcus's cabin sat modestly near a forest trailhead, its weathered wood blending seamlessly with the pine and fir. Inside, every item had a place. Boots lined neatly by the door. A well-worn ranger's field journal stacked on a wooden shelf. Maps pinned to walls, showing every contour and creek of the backcountry he patrolled. His day started before sunrise, a ritual of coffee, map review, and checking the condition of vehicles and gear before venturing into remote terrain. Evenings were quieter, dishes washed, logs stacked for the fire, and the faint click of a clock, marking a steady rhythm that had defined his life for years. Marcus had few close relationships, but the ones he maintained were deeply rooted. A mentor within the Park Service had guided him in the early years, shaping his respect for the wilderness and the responsibility of stewardship. Neighbors recognized him by his quiet diligence and the dogged commitment that often kept him patrolling areas others avoided. His solitude was never loneliness. It was a chosen discipline, a life in tune with the natural world. Yet it left him reliant on predictability, on routine, and on the sense of safety that his cabin and community afforded. Yet, beneath the calm surface of his disciplined life, the fragility of that safety was always present, even if unseen. The backcountry he traversed was as dangerous in its human elements as in its natural hazards, and the evening of his disappearance would shatter that fragile balance entirely. What seemed like ordinary nightfall would become the threshold between life as Marcus knew it and a silence that stretched across 8 years. Where are you watching from tonight? And what time is it there? Marcus's daily rhythm in Gardner, Montana, was defined by precision and solitude, yet anchored by the small, tangible relationships he maintained. His cabin, modest and sturdy, stood a short walk from the main road, nestled among towering pines that filtered the late afternoon light into dappled patterns on the forest floor. Mornings began long before the town stirred, the aroma of brewed coffee filling the kitchen while he reviewed maps and checked radio frequencies. Meals were simple, often eaten alone at a wooden table that bore the marks of years of careful use. Evenings followed a deliberate cadence. Dinner prepared, gear inspected, firewood stacked for the night. The clockwork of these routines was both a comfort and a shield against the unpredictable wilderness beyond his doorstep. Though solitary, Marcus maintained quiet bonds that were integral to his sense of stability. A mentor in the Park Service had been a constant figure since his early years on the job, offering guidance on navigation, safety, and the unspoken ethics of wilderness stewardship. Neighbors saw him as a dependable presence. His solitary patrols often reassured local residents, even as they rarely saw him beyond the fleeting wave or nod. His dog, a constant companion, followed him everywhere on his property, a living reminder of responsibility and routine, the warmth of another being anchoring him to domestic life. Even within this disciplined existence, small vulnerabilities persisted. The cabin's back door, often left unlocked for convenience, creaked in the wind, and one window faced directly toward the road, providing a clear view of approaching vehicles or people. Marcus had never feared intrusion. The town was small, the neighbors attentive, the forested backdrop familiar. Yet these overlooked details, minor in the rhythm of daily life, would become critical in understanding how that night unfolded. Peripheral adults, delivery drivers bringing supplies, park maintenance personnel, local repair workers were occasional presences in his routines. Polite and brief, barely leaving a ripple in the ordered flow of life. Their familiarity was part of the town's texture, yet it inadvertently created patterns that someone watching could note. Marcus's interactions with these figures were courteous but distant, bound by necessity rather than intimacy, leaving him unaware of how visible his predictable schedule had become. The evening settled over the cabin with quiet inevitability. Shadows stretched across the walls, the scent of pine drifting through the open window. The dog curled at the foot of the bed. Outside, the faint hum of distant traffic and the occasional rustle of wildlife punctuated the air. Everything appeared undisturbed, ordinary in its routine. Yet beneath this ordinary surface, the stage was set for a rupture that would transform his ordered existence into an enduring mystery. The cabin, the forested paths, the familiar faces, all elements of safety, were about to be permeated by a presence that belonged to no one he knew. As night drew in, the calm of domestic life was complete, a deceptive cocoon that would soon be penetrated. Marcus followed his usual sequence, checking equipment, noting conditions for tomorrow's patrol, securing doors and windows with habitual precision. The dog's quiet whine near the door was the only audible acknowledgement of the world beyond. Everything was in place, and yet the vulnerability inherent in routine, the predictable paths, the singular residence, the known windows and doors remained unconsidered, waiting silently for the breach that would render time itself ambiguous. The final day began with the same quiet discipline that had marked Marcus Hale's life for years. At 5:30 a.m., he rose while the sky was still muted with pre-dawn gray, brewed his coffee, and reviewed patrol maps for the routes he would cover that morning. By 6:15 a.m., his dog padded alongside him as he checked radio equipment, ensuring all frequencies were operational and contacts logged. Breakfast was minimal: a slice of toast, a boiled egg, and then the patrol began. To anyone observing from the town of Gardner, everything appeared routine, professional, even mundane. By late afternoon, Marcus returned briefly to the cabin to drop off gear and consult with his mentor over radio channels, discussing trail conditions and wildlife reports. The air was warm but crisp, the kind that carried the scent of pine needles and distant rivers. He returned to the forest trails, moving deliberately along paths he had traversed hundreds of times. The terrain was familiar. His instincts were sharp. The evening hours passed with the quiet hum of nature, the occasional call of a bird, the distant clang of a ranger station bell. As dusk settled, the cabin's interior became a sanctuary of routine. Marcus returned, unpacked his gear, and prepared the small fireplace for the night. The dog stretched on the warm rug, and the muted glow from a single lamp cast long shadows across the wooden floors. Outside, the wind shifted in the pines, creating a low, whispering sound that seemed to echo through the trees. Somewhere along the property line, a faint rustle disturbed the stillness, but it went unnoticed. All was as it should be, or so it seemed. Around 10:45 p.m., a household presence stirred a neighbor checking in, a passing hiker returning from the trails, but their attention never lingered long. Marcus finished his final check of equipment and doors by 11:05 p.m. The back door, habitually left unlocked, creaked slightly as it settled in the night air. Windows reflected the faint lamplight inside, glimmering against the darkness outside. And for a fleeting moment, a figure or a shadow appeared near the edge of the cabin, lingering at the threshold before disappearing into the dark. The dog growled softly, sensing disturbance, but Marcus, attentive yet unalarmed by minor forest noises, did not notice. Later that night, a brief, half-conscious stir from a nearby neighbor or mentor caught a movement in the periphery of vision, the suggestion of someone near the cabin, just at the corner of awareness. They doubted themselves, convincing their mind that it was a trick of shadow and fatigue. Sleep resumed, and with it, the ordinary rhythms of the household persisted, unaware that one life was on the cusp of sudden, unexplainable rupture. By morning, the alarm became undeniable. Marcus was gone. His gear remained inside, the cabin doors closed but unlatched, the single lamp still casting its soft glow across the wooden floor. The dog paced restlessly, sensing absence, its anxiety punctuating the otherwise serene morning. A neighbor, stepping in to deliver a message or check in as part of daily routine, immediately recognized the anomaly. The search began within minutes, first sweeping the cabin, then the property, then the surrounding trails. Confusion quickly escalated into panic as the reality sank in. This was no simple disappearance. And if stories like this keep you pulled in, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss what comes next. The first patrol car arrived within the hour, sirens muted by distance but growing steadily closer, and the quiet forest air seemed to tighten around the cabin like a held breath. Law enforcement arrived swiftly, though the early morning light cast long shadows across the property, masking the details that would soon prove crucial. The sheriff, a man who had seen many backcountry accidents but few disappearances, moved deliberately, methodically, alongside his deputy. Every step through the cabin was measured. Floorboards creaked underfoot, lamps flickered with the dawn, and the faint scent of pine mixed with last night's smoke from the small fireplace. They recorded the scene with careful eyes, the neatly made bed, Marcus's gear stowed just so, a faint indentation in the rug where his dog had lain. Windows and doors were inspected. The habitual unlocking of the back door noted as a possible point of entry. The neighbor's account of movement the previous night was taken seriously, but met with polite skepticism. The shadow, the fleeting presence near the cabin, they all sounded plausible, yet intangible. Nevertheless, these observations were logged in the growing file. Photographs captured every angle, and every minor detail meticulously documented. The officers understood the difference between a routine missing person and a potential abduction, and they treated every trace with caution, aware that the smallest oversight could obscure a critical clue. By mid-morning, a coordinated search had begun. Volunteers from Gardner joined local law enforcement, fanning out across fields, creek beds, and the dense forest trails Marcus knew so well. K-9 units traced scents that seemed to begin and abruptly end at the edge of the property. Footprints were found near the cabin's back entrance, adult-sized, firm, moving away from the structure toward the tree line. Nearby, a small personal item belonging to Marcus, a leather-bound journal, lay partially hidden in the underbrush, pages slightly damp from overnight condensation. Flattened grass suggested someone had paused, perhaps kneeling, perhaps checking on the path ahead. A faint scuff mark on the forest floor hinted at a struggle, though it was subtle, easily overlooked by untrained eyes. Despite the thorough sweep, no signs of Marcus himself were found. The evidence collected, photographs, footprints, the journal, impressions in the soil, was carefully bagged and labeled, yet the investigative tools of 2018 were limited. Surveillance cameras were non-existent along the back trails, and digital tracking devices were unavailable. The scene was preserved, but the tangible thread connecting the evidence to a living person remained a elusive dot as the search teams worked. The sheriff observed a cluster of signs near the cabin and paused. Something about the arrangement of footprints, the disturbed earth, and the abandoned personal items suggested a deliberate act, not the aimless wandering of someone lost or a voluntary departure. The unease grew, settling into the pit of the stomach like the chill of the morning air. The realization became unavoidable. Marcus had been taken by another human presence. The ordinary life he had led, the routines that had insulated him in the wilderness and at home, had been pierced by an intruder, leaving only faint traces of a night that no one had fully witnessed. Every volunteer and officer returned with reports, photographs, and measurements, forming the earliest threads of a story that would later unravel across years of silence. The cabin, once a place of predictable safety, now bore the mark of intrusion. An unsettling reminder that even the most familiar environments could conceal danger. The forest, the journal, the prints, they all whispered of absence, of life interrupted, and of a search that was only beginning in earnest. Back at the sheriff's office, the evidence was laid out across worn wooden tables, photographs pinned to corkboards, notes carefully arranged to reconstruct the night's events. The deputy and sheriff reviewed every footprint, every flattened patch of grass, every scuff mark near Marcus's cabin. It became clear that this was no accidental disappearance. The evidence suggested deliberate removal by another person. By mid-afternoon, the case was formally reclassified as an abduction. A missing person report was no longer sufficient. The signs indicated a calculated act. Someone familiar enough with the terrain to avoid detection, yet bold enough to intrude into what had been a secure home. The investigative team began building a preliminary suspect list, focusing on individuals with access to Marcus or the surrounding area. Neighbors, delivery personnel, park maintenance staff, and colleagues were all scrutinized. One man, a seasonal ranger assigned to nearby trails, emerged as a prime suspect. He had been seen in proximity to Marcus's cabin during previous patrols and had a history of minor infractions within the Park Service. The investigators studied his schedule, interviewed associates, and noted subtle inconsistencies in his statements, raising initial suspicion. Interrogation of this individual was thorough, but revealed objective inconsistencies. Records placed him elsewhere during the critical window. Shoe tread patterns did not match prints at the scene, and a verified alibi confirmed he could not have been present during the night of the disappearance. Though suspicion had been warranted, it ultimately fell away under the weight of hard evidence. This red herring highlighted the diligence of the investigation, demonstrating that even plausible suspects must be measured against factual benchmarks. The search continued, expanding beyond Gardner into surrounding valleys, wooded areas, and the edges of Yellowstone itself. State officials briefly reviewed the case, noting the abduction appeared controlled and calm, the perpetrator familiar with the terrain and Marcus's predictable routines. Yet, despite the breadth of effort, no new physical evidence emerged. There was no ransom note, no credible witness report, no vehicle identified. Weeks stretched into months, months into years, and the file gradually moved from active to inactive status. The emotional toll was immediate and profound. Colleagues who had known Marcus for years carried guilt and uncertainty, wondering if they had missed a subtle sign. Neighbors and friends felt the anxiety of unresolved fear, a quiet weight that lingered in conversations and shared silences. The deputy and sheriff, once methodical and confident, now harbored a lingering sense of failure. The file a constant reminder of the limits of even the most thorough investigation. As the case was archived, the box containing Marcus's journal, photographs, prints, and notes was placed on a storage shelf. Dust began to collect on its edges, and the label marking his name and year, Marcus Hale, 2018, faded slightly under fluorescent light. The careful work of the initial investigation, the meticulous attention to detail, was preserved, yet dormant. If you want to know what investigators uncovered next, go ahead and like this video. Years passed, and the town of Gardner shifted around the absence of Marcus Hale. Businesses opened and closed, the rhythm of tourism along the northern edge of Yellowstone evolving with each passing season. Police staff changed over the years, new technology arrived, and methods of record-keeping slowly modernized. Amid these changes, the box containing the evidence of Marcus's disappearance remained untouched, moved only during office reorganizations or digitization projects. Its survival was almost accidental, a testament to bureaucratic diligence and sheer chance. Family members aged, carrying their grief quietly. A mentor in the Park Service retired, often recalling Marcus during solitary patrols, feeling a hollow weight where companionship once had been. Neighbors who had shared casual greetings or brief encounters with Marcus spoke of him in hushed tones, remembering the presence of someone deeply committed, yet suddenly absent. Some kept photographs, letters, or small personal items, while others avoided reminders altogether, unable to bear the constant tug of unresolved questions. Meanwhile, in a parallel reality, Marcus was living elsewhere under another identity. The details of this life were fragmented and opaque to those who once knew him. School and work records contained altered birth dates, inconsistent addresses, and vague explanations for his past. Any teacher, employer, or neighbor who sensed irregularities dismissed them in the absence of formal evidence or central databases capable of connecting disparate records. The systemic gaps of the earlier decades, no nationwide DNA tracking, no unified missing person registry enabled, his concealment without any overt coercion visible to outsiders. Within Marcus, there existed a persistent, gnawing sense of dislocation. Flashbacks, vivid, unmoored fragments of his former life, surfaced in dreams or moments of quiet reflection. The smell of pine from his cabin, the dog curled at his feet, the texture of worn maps and journal pages. Faces, voices, gestures, memories without context haunted him in ordinary tasks, leaving a persistent awareness of a life he could not name. The routine of survival under a false identity created structure, yet it could not fill the void left by years of absence from his true home. The box of evidence sat on a shelf as a silent witness, its contents unexamined, yet it bore the key to unraveling decades of hidden truth. Faded photographs, carefully labeled notes, and the preserved physical traces of the night Marcus vanished were all waiting for a moment when modern technology would intersect with old records. That moment, while still distant, carried the weight of inevitability. If you could tell someone what really happened all those years ago, who would you speak to first? The box remained, dusted with neglect but intact, a quiet sentinel over the years of uncertainty, carrying the potential to bridge two lives separated by time, concealment, and circumstance. Under a new name and an assumed life, Marcus Hale had navigated years of careful concealment. Now 42 years old, he moved through the routines of adulthood with the same quiet diligence that had defined his days in Gardner, Montana, yet a persistent unease shadowed every step. Employment required documentation, leases demanded proof of identity, and medical appointments required personal history, each encounter underscoring the fragility of the constructed life he inhabited. Records were internally consistent enough to avoid scrutiny, but bore subtle inconsistencies. Birth dates that shifted by months, school histories that skipped years, and references to a childhood that never matched the images in his mind. Despite a stable exterior, Marcus lived with chronic dislocation. Dreams or brief recollections of another home, the smell of pine, the creak of a cabin floor, the rhythm of a life left behind surfaced with startling clarity. Faces without names appeared in fleeting memories. Voices half-remembered whispered across his consciousness. Each recollection was a reminder that his life under a false identity, no matter how well constructed, could never fully replace the life stolen from him. Systemic blind spots had protected him for decades. Local records were siloed. There was no centralized database linking counties, no digital footprint tracing him to Yellowstone, and no DNA system capable of connecting a life in the present to traces preserved in the past. The world had shifted around him, yet the gap between his two lives remained secure. A temporal and bureaucratic shadow keeping the truth out of reach. Everything changed on an otherwise ordinary day. A legal requirement, a claim to inheritance after the death of the person who had provided his assumed identity, required Marcus to submit his fingerprints to a modern state database. The act was procedural, routine, and entirely unremarkable on the surface. Yet the moment his fingerprints entered the system, an automatic match occurred. Traces preserved from the cabin in 2018 latent. Prints collected with painstaking care now, aligned with the prints of the man who had lived these intervening years under another name. The alert reverberated quietly through the modern investigative system, flagging the long dormant file labeled Marcus Hale, 2018, for immediate review. A modern cold case investigator, specialized in dormant files, pulled the evidence from storage. The journal, photographs, labeled bags of soil, footprints, and the meticulous notes from 8 years prior. The intersection of preserved evidence and contemporary technology had suddenly collapsed the years of uncertainty, collapsing Marcus's two lives into a single, undeniable truth. If you could tell someone what really happened all those years ago, who would you speak to first? The investigator, methodical and patient, examined the flagged evidence with the precision and care of someone trained to see patterns in decades-old chaos. Every item in the box suddenly carried new significance, and every fragment of the past became a thread leading to revelation. The quiet tension of 8 years of absence gave way to the first stirrings of resolution, poised to reconnect a man to the life from which he had been stolen. The modern cold case investigator approached the file with a combination of rigor and reverence. Years of experience had taught them that even decades-old cases could yield revelations when examined with contemporary tools. The office was quiet, lit by the soft glow of fluorescent lights, the hum of computers, and the occasional shuffle of evidence folders. The box containing Marcus Hale's preserved items sat open on the table, each photograph, print, and journal carefully inspected. There was a palpable weight in the air, as if the accumulated years of uncertainty pressed down with every turn of a page. Every piece of old evidence was sent for modern forensic analysis. Soil samples from footprints near the cabin were cross-referenced against geolocation databases, linking the path traced in 2018 to areas Marcus's abductor had frequented. Hair fibers were examined with advanced microscopy, revealing consistency with a single individual connected to multiple residences in Montana over the intervening years. Shoe tread analysis, previously limited to photographs, now identified the make and model of the intruder's footwear, suggesting both occupation and access patterns. Digitized property records, tax filings, and employment logs placed the suspected abductor in proximity to Marcus's cabin at the exact window of the disappearance. Each connection, once invisible to investigators in 2018, now emerged with clarity. The timeline was reconstructed meticulously. The investigator merged Marcus's movements with the abductor's known history. The patrol routes, the nightly routines, the sudden gaps in the abductor's documented activity all converged on that night when Marcus vanished. The evidence painted a picture of a calculated, controlled abduction by someone with intimate knowledge of Marcus's habits and the surrounding terrain. No random chance, no wandering misstep, just the deliberate orchestration of a life interrupted. Administrative records and cross-referenced. Evidence allowed authorities to identify the abductor definitively. Patterns in residence, employment, and access confirmed that a single adult had orchestrated Marcus's disappearance. Though the abductor was now deceased, the official record could finally name them as the primary offender, providing clarity that had eluded investigators for 8 years. The file, once dormant and shadowed by uncertainty, now carried the weight of definitive resolution. As the investigator prepared to contact Marcus under his assumed identity, the gravity of the moment was clear. The collision of time, technology, and preserved evidence had restored a missing piece of the past. The man who had lived a life separated from his true self was about to learn the full scope of what had happened, the truth of the abduction, and the identity of the person who had stolen those years. The procedural caution of the investigator mingled with a sense of human responsibility. This was more than a file. It was a life waiting to be restored. Marcus received the news in a quiet office, the hum of computers and faint shuffle of papers filling the room. The investigator explained in careful, measured narration that his fingerprints had matched those collected at the cabin in Gardner 8 years earlier. The evidence was undeniable. The man sitting before them, living under an assumed identity, was the long-missing Marcus Hale. Shock settled first, a sudden and disorienting weight pressing on his chest. Denial lingered for a moment, the mind unwilling to accept that the life he had known, the carefully constructed routines, had been built atop a lie of abduction and concealment. DNA testing followed quickly. Blood samples were collected from surviving relatives' parents who had aged into their late 60s, a mentor who had retired from the Park Service, neighbors who had kept photographs in albums faded by time. The laboratory analysis confirmed biological kinship. Marcus was unmistakably connected to those who had waited for him, hoped for him, and mourned his absence. The certainty of the science underscored the emotional reality. The man before them was no longer simply a person living in hiding. He was the son, the friend, the colleague who had been taken years before. The first meetings were tentative, emotional, and profound. His parents' hands trembled as they reached for his, recognition flaring in a gaze that searched for every familiar gesture, every scar, every subtle mannerism. The mentor observed quietly, absorbing the living proof of years lost. Conversations were filled with pauses, the language of rediscovery. Small stories shared, objects remembered, phrases repeated that only Marcus could have known. The dog of memory imagined. Unspoken haunted the edges of recollection as all involved tried to reconcile the stolen years with the life now standing before them. Integrating 2 lifetimes was both delicate and painful. Marcus grappled with the life he had been forced to live under a false identity and the one he had lost in the abrupt abduction. Each memory of his earlier existence collided with decades of self-preservation and adaptation, creating a mosaic of conflicting experience. His family balanced joy and relief with a quiet grief for time irretrievably lost, and an undercurrent of anger toward the person who had taken him, whose identity had been officially named and recorded, but could not undo the past. The cold case investigator finalized the file as resolved, but the true resolution extended far beyond paperwork. It resided in the measured breaths of a father holding a son, in Marcus's tentative rediscovery of the home and life that had been interrupted, and in the quiet acknowledgement that while justice in procedural terms could now be recorded, The personal journey of healing had only just begun. The box of evidence, once gathering dust on a shelf, had fulfilled its purpose. It had restored identity, reclaimed history, and bridged years of absence with a truth long overdue. With Marcus's identity confirmed and the cold case officially reopened, authorities updated the records to reflect the full scope of the 2018 disappearance. The abductor, now definitively named, was recorded as the primary offender. The incident was reclassified in official documents as an abduction consistent with both the terminology of the original era and modern legal standards. While the abductor could not face trial, having passed away years earlier, their actions were no longer anonymous, and the decades-long gap in accountability was formally acknowledged. Motives remained partially obscured. Investigators pieced together fragments of the abductor's life. Familiarity with Marcus's routines, knowledge of the terrain, and meticulous planning suggested calculated intent rather than impulsive action. Yet the deeper reasons, psychological, personal, or otherwise, remain beyond full comprehension. Authorities and family alike grappled with the unsettling reality that some aspects of human behavior may never be fully understood, and that closure often comes without the full narrative of why. The case illuminated critical systemic lessons. Careful evidence retention had preserved latent fingerprints, soil samples, and personal effects that decades later became the linchpin for resolution. Cross-jurisdictional data sharing and modern biometric databases had created the pathway for rediscovery, highlighting the necessity of integrating technology with meticulous human oversight. Early witness statements, once doubted, had been preserved, reinforcing the importance of listening to and documenting observations from those closest to a vulnerable individual. Emotionally, the resolution restored Marcus's true identity and granted his family the recognition of what had been taken from them. The reunion, though bittersweet, affirmed the enduring value of truth and the capacity of cold case work to correct historical wrongs. While stolen years could not be returned, the acknowledgement of those years and the reclamation of a life interrupted provided a measure of justice that was both tangible and symbolic. Marcus's story now stood as a testament to resilience, careful investigation, and the quiet power of persistence over time. The lessons extended beyond the family, serving as a reminder to law enforcement, community members, and anyone responsible for preserving evidence that diligence and patience can ultimately restore what was lost. Late truth, painstakingly uncovered, reshapes not only the understanding of a life, but also the broader moral and social recognition of responsibility, care, and empathy for the most vulnerable. And when you're ready, click the video on the right to explore another case.